Geopolitics Empire is joined by returning guest, Venezuelan-American Jose Niño, who is a commentator and political analyst who will be discussing the U.S. border and migrant situation. Thanks for joining the podcast once again, Jose. How is life in Texas?
Oh, it's going quite well. Yeah, the lockdown stuff has been loosening for the past few months and things are going back to normal. I mean, you do see some people all masked up and stuff, but generally speaking, things are going the way they should be, though other states are not doing so well in the U.S., obviously.
I hope we continue down that pathway of returning to some sort of normal, but I fear that we might have a dark winter and they're going to lock everything down again. That's my feeling. Unfortunately, time will tell. So the last time I discussed the border issue was with left-wing author Todd Miller. Today, we'll be looking at it from a contrarian, dissident, right, conservative point of view, as you sort of paint yourself. Perhaps we can start with the piece you wrote for Substack on Mexico. You write about how cartel power is growing and creating insecurity on the border, as well as within the U.S. In fact, recently, Chile warned that Mexican cartels were attempting to set up shop in their country. You've also written about the tens of thousands of Haitians that are now coming to Texas. I've kind of lost track of it. First, I read that, like 10, 20,000 Haitians are coming in. Now, I just read today and like 80,000 might be coming in. So you're observing the situation from ground zero in Austin. In terms of U.S. border security, what's going on? What's going wrong on the frontera?
Well, at the moment, the U.S. has a pretty globalist administration that tends to take a much more open borders approach, a much laxer approach to immigration, as opposed to, say, the Trump administration. Whatever faults the Trump administration had, it did put the idea of border security on the priority of issues that it was going to tackle. Because if we go back to the Bush era, especially, that's when I got into politics. That's when the border issue really got out of hand. And then you had the Obama administration that really didn't do much. And then we saw a reaction in the form of Trump, the election of Donald Trump in 2016. He ran on a Pat Buchanan light type of platform where he was actually talking about border security. He got some policies here and there, like remain in Mexico, also restricting like public charges, like people who ended up on the dole couldn't really come in. And he got somewhat of an immigration moratorium implemented during the Wuhan virus pandemic. Obviously, these didn't go far enough because I've long advocated for not only like a very strong border wall, but also an immigration moratorium, the way the U.S. had from the 1920s up until the 1960s before the passage of the Hart-Celler Act. Pat Buchanan also strongly supported that. And to some extent, Donald Trump did allude to that on the campaign trail, and he got that piecemeal during the pandemic. But now with Biden in office, they are going back to kind of the status quo, if you will, though border security is still somewhat tighter than in previous administrations, like, say, the Obama and Bush administration, because of the fact that there is a kind of reversion to tighter border security in some senses because of the deglobalization going on right now and the reorientation of supply chains. Nevertheless, they are trying to bring in migrants whenever they can, whether it's the Afghans or Haitians. But what we're seeing, though, is that there's a gradual uptick of migrants. And I think that the Biden administration, all things being equal, would very likely try to open the floodgates as much as possible because they have a very strong electoral incentive to do so, for one, because migrant groups, when you look at the data, they go 60-40 or up to like 70-30 Democrats in elections, especially them and their posterity. So they have a very strong electoral incentive to do that, as well as there's a very strong cheap labor incentive too. And this cuts across Republicans as well. There are strong oligarchs in both parties that want never-ending flows of cheap labor to continue to flood in. Nevertheless, I am somewhat optimistic because of the gridlock in DC. And even some Democrats in swing states, they're pretty hesitant about passing a mass amnesty bill right now because we are in a pretty dire economic situation where millions of Americans are out of work. So just adding in a massive labor pool of like new migrants in is something that most people would not be happy with and could cause a massive backlash. And I think even the most globalist of Democrats are kind of coming to that realization, which is why you've seen news stories of the current amnesty bill that's being proposed. They're basically trying to sneak it into the gigantic infrastructure bill. That it's now pretty much dead. Nevertheless, the border security still remains an issue because you obviously have Mexican cartels that are very active. And then you just have also a US doesn't really put much of a premium on border security because let's face it, the US is more concerned with securing the borders of its like client states, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Israel, South Korea, Japan, you name it, Germany. All the US has really deprioritized Latin America for the most part in terms of its grand strategy and overall security infrastructure. So you're going to have a lot of problems where Mexico and Central America, especially Central America, because that's where most of the migrants are coming these days. Mexican migration has actually decreased substantially over the past decade to the US. So you have like, in effect, a kind of vacuum, if you will, where the US lack of attention in Latin America is creating a lot of issues. And many NGOs, globalist NGOs have taken advantage of this to use not just even like Central America or Mexico as launch pads, but even countries like Ecuador and others to move migrants all the way up and form these caravans. And what my whole thing is that if we're going to have like a national security state or a rational defense policy or whatever, it starts at our border. It should be to secure our sovereignty and not use it to nation build or intervene in countries that are not within the US's traditional sphere of influence. And we should have proactive cooperation with countries in the region. And that's one thing I think that Trump and AMLO did really well, is that they were able to build pretty solid relations in terms of stopping a lot of migration from Central America going through Mexico. And they were able to constructively do that. But I think we obviously need to do more. And unfortunately, the current ruling class that we have in DC is just not up to the task.
Speaking of AMLO and Mexico, so this week, Mexico announced that too will be giving asylum to 13,000 Haitians. I don't know what to make of that. On one hand, I feel migrants need to be respected and helped. But on the other hand, I don't think we can allow migration to run roughshod. I've actually had migrants threaten my life outside the home of a family member here in Mexico. We were loading some things into a car one night in the city, and a young migrant jokingly said out loud, what if I kill the guy and just take his stuff? And I turned to stare at him sternly until he just said, just kidding. And so, I think migration should always be via the legal route so immigrants can work legally and also be expelled if they aren't behaving properly. I've lived by those same rules myself as a guest in foreign countries. What are your thoughts on the migrant situation in Mexico and how Mexico is dealing with its southern border, especially if we look at Mexico as a buffer to U.S. border security?
I haven't studied Mexico in much detail with regards to its immigration, but it actually, if you look at its overall laws, they're pretty restrictive. If you compare it to like the US, they generally are pretty strict about enforcing, at least like before AMLO, they have enforced them pretty strongly when it comes to like Central American migration. It's just that these migrants would just go to Mexico and it'd be like a launch pad and they just move up to the US, but they would not like be staying in Mexico. I think that immigration is an issue that should go according to the national interest, because even legal migration at times could be detrimental to the national interest, especially from countries like, let's face it, that are known for weaponizing their migration to create fifth columns. You see this with Turkish migration to Europe, which is basically a fifth column over there. That's why you hear the term of the long arm of Ankara with regards to Erdogan's grand strategy to project Turkish influence in European states without having to use conventional warfare. And you see this same thing too with Chinese migration across the board from Canada all the way to the US, where it's used as a way to basically facilitate mass corporate espionage. This is the 21st century style of warfare, and you don't need to fire a shot. And many people, especially neocons and neoliberals, haven't really gotten that. And that's why I think that we are long overdue for a pause. There are certain times, especially like, say, during the 19th century, especially the Industrial Revolution, where it made sense to have pretty large pools of immigration. But then there's other times, especially during like a pandemic and a deglobalization phase, where it just makes sense to retrench when it comes to migration and restrict and look for, like, say, more skilled migrants or people that actually can add like immense value when it comes to like nuclear power or just like geniuses. Obviously, I if you have like a spouse or whatever, I'm in favor of that. But I think that there has to be much more of a retrench national policy with regards to immigration, and one that basically suits the national interests of the U.S.
Right. And what you said about Mexico trying to protect its southern border is what my previous guest, Todd Miller, said as well, that Mexico has been trying to protect the border. And as well, what you say about migration as a weapon. I was listening recently to a really great channel, Balkan Info, which is in Serbian, but there was a Serbian official basically saying how there's the possibility that, the weapons that were left behind in Afghanistan that went to the Taliban, we might see people from the Afghan region, as well as from the Middle East, now going straight into Europe and causing a huge mess in Europe, as well as you mentioned, Turkey is egging that on. You also have written about Florida Governor Ron DeSantis' lawsuit against the Biden administration, calling its immigration policy of relocating illegal immigrants, illegal. Your thoughts on this, as well as, looking at Florida sort of as a microcosm. What do you think DeSantis and the Florida resistance will be successful in, leading the way toward reversing some of the, broader tyrannical policies that we're experiencing at the national level?
Well, yeah, Ron DeSantis is an interesting character. He has kind of surprised me because before he kind of struck me as neocon light and somewhat of an establishment figure when he was in Congress. He was like kind of your typical Israel firster type of Republican that was just always like regurgitating generic talking points. But when he came into office in Florida, he has surprised me specifically for his resistance to the lockdowns and everything. And he's done a pretty excellent job in that. He's kind of set the standard on that ground. And now he's just also taking that kind of contrarian approach to politics with regards to immigration. DeSantis has actually gotten some decent immigration reforms in terms of cracking down on sanctuary cities in Florida, as well as tightening up the labor market there by implementing a form of e-verify to make sure that illegals don't get hired in private businesses and also like state contractors as well. And he's now following up all of that with his recent lawsuit to stop like the use of like state resources and even federal resources to relocate migrants, illegal aliens in Florida. And I think this is where immigration policy is kind of going, where you're seeing a lot of states file lawsuits, and even some like Texas are taking the matter into their own hands. It's starting to enter into the discourse that red states will be taking more proactive measures to try to secure their own borders and implement their own immigration policies. In fact, in Texas, you see in the gubernatorial primaries, Governor Greg Abbott has two challengers running to his right in Alan West and Don Huffines. Don Huffines is actually a Ron Paul supporter, but he's a guy who thinks that the state government should take over the immigration question. He doesn't see the federal government as a competent enough entity to do that. And even Alan West has called for the creation of a border patrol agency within Texas to handle all like immigration security measures. So you're seeing a change in the discourse now where states are going to start assuming more power. And if you look at it historically speaking, immigration in the US used to be very decentralized in the 19th century up until the 1870s and 1880s, when the federal government started to take a more active role on the matter. You had states basically be able to expel immigrants that just behave improperly, that engage in criminal behavior, didn't fit the profile of the city or county they were in, or even those that winded up on the public dole, they were able to expel them. That's what the model used to be. But I think now, as DC just gets more dysfunctional and the polarization in the US gets stronger, you're going to see states take on more controversial roles within their own jurisdictions as opposed to relying on DC to pass laws, because there's a lot of gridlock in DC. And it seems that in DC, the ruling class there is more concerned with administrating rather than governing, which means that you have a bunch of bureaucrats passing a bunch of edicts that no one voted on in complete defiance of like a democratic will or any type of proper legislative procedure. So you're going to see like more bureaucratic tyranny. And as a result, states will probably start resisting or start assuming roles that the federal government traditionally held, because I think the US is going through a kind of overall breakdown, and you're going to see just much more localism, I believe, in the next few decades.
So do you think this kind of what you've been touching on, we can see a trend here where states are taking back power? This is sort of kind of like a decentralization, and you've outlined in the background this scenario of balkanization, or we've talked about previously like a light kind of maybe ideological civil war, economic civil war, some type of political civil war. Do you think? And you've written about secession. Do you think there's any meat to this idea of some states possibly seceding? Because I think if something like that happened, I mean, that would be a really big deal.
Yeah, secession is a complicated topic because it's definitely much harder to do when you have, at least in the present, when you have like a strong state like the US, because a lot of secession movements tend to happen in very heterogeneous states, or even states where like the state capacity breaks down and the central government just can't really allow it. Right now, you have like this really weird conglomeration of like state power and corporate power in the US that I think would inhibit like a secessionist movement outright at the moment. Nevertheless, I do think the nullification and the localization of a lot of politics are the first steps you need to have before entertaining secession. I do think like in a distant future, it's very distinct possibility if the US doesn't get its economic house in order, or if it faces geopolitical reversals abroad, that it will have a breakdown in order. And I think that's when secession will likely happen, whenever there's a really huge loss of confidence in the system, whether it's because of economic breakdowns or that the central government has become so alien to large swaths of the country. It will happen. But I think right now, what's here to stay is nullification. We've already seen it with marijuana legalization. A lot of people don't realize this, that numerous states have already passed marijuana legalization laws in complete defiance of the feds. And then you're seeing this start to happen with the Second Amendment sanctuary movement in the US, where a lot of these counties and cities are beginning to resist not only state level gun control, but also even federal level gun control. And then on immigration, I think you're going to start seeing that as well. It's going to be a whole host of issues too, from abortion and what have you, because a lot of people are starting to lose confidence in DC. They just don't trust it. It's becoming much more alien. So they're going to be turning more towards the state governments. I wouldn't say this is going to be resulting in like secession in the next 5 years, but I think there is a groundwork being laid for it. What really has to happen, I think, is like some pretty big like black swan event, like a total currency collapse or some type of geopolitical event to really accelerate it. But I think the US' current constitutional order is probably not long for this world, though. I think that the US is going through a transformation, and it's not going to look anything similar to what most people were accustomed to learning about in their civics textbooks.
I want to go back to what you touched on earlier about globalism, ideology, why this is all happening. Of course, in relation to the migration issue, of course, one reason is blowback from a century of American imperialism and destruction of Latin America. Let's not mince words. The U.S. empire stole so much wealth and left behind failed states in Central and South America, from Honduras and Haiti, and which is why these people are now in a desperate situation. But on the other hand, we are witnessing the ideology of globalism at play. And as you mentioned, the Biden administration, Democratic Party are full on globalists. I would argue that the Republicans and I'll call it conservative incorporated, so to speak. Right. They could be classified as globalists as well, based on their collusion and their inaction. And I see this basically kind of the idea of ancient Babylon, right? The Tower of Babel, to mix together the world's cultures, traditions, tribes, to form one giant multicultural empire and new identity, because by then erasing traditional forms of identity, this leaves individuals and groups of people with no way of defending themselves, right? Because once you have no cultural, spiritual, national, patriotic identity or roots, you have nothing then to defend. You then are made a subject of this new identity of globalism, and you're kind of in their hands. And then this you've also mentioned as well, it creates an electoral pipeline for Democrats, and it augments the power of the managerial state. So, I mean, do you see any other, like, in your mind, goals of globalism, and why they're doing this? Because I see they're doing the same thing in the European Union, where the EU is made up of 28 compact states with their own identities, and they're trying to erase those identities and try to create this Tower of Babel again in Europe. And it seems like they're trying to do that in the US as well.
Yeah, globalism is basically about like erasing national identities at its core, and where you no longer have like an organic nation state with an organic culture. And like the US is basically deformed into a shopping mall with nukes. Like, let's face it, it's no longer like the historic Americana that people were used to from like the 1880s up until like the 1950s, give or take. And it's turned into a global consumer imperium. And what's funny is, with regards to Latin American migration, it kind of fulfills the goals of the Knights of the Golden Circle in the 19th century, where they wanted to actually basically annex a lot of Latin America and create this like weird type of Anglo imperium that, with like Latin American features, like just like dominate the entire Western hemisphere. And in many ways, the mass migration and the breakdown of borders of not just the US, but also of these other Latin American countries. Because let's face it, whenever these countries are being used as launch pads for migrants, they're basically losing their sovereignty. This applies to Mexico. This applies to Panama, Ecuador, and even Colombia as well. So like the idea that it's just like the US that's being assaulted by this, it's really not. It's like all these countries, they're being treated as just shopping malls for big capital and NGOs that want to destabilize countries. So yeah, it's all about creating a rootless cosmopolitan elite, these Davos, man, that can just go from country to country and not show any loyalty to those cultures and work to destabilize it. Fundamentally, the ethos of the ruling class in the US and Europe is invade the world, invite the world. You invade these countries, completely destabilize them. You bring in a bunch of refugees, which creates a huge polarization cycle, because some of these cultures are just frankly alien to like the historic American nation or Europe, and that creates a lot of tension. And then you just encourage this never-ending cycle of migration, which it serves a corporate interest, because not only they get cheap labor, they also get a bunch of consumer units. A lot of ethnic grievance lobbies love it too, because now they can become these diversity commissars when you have so many unassimilable migrants. It's just like it's like Viagra for the managerial state, because now you can justify creating a whole new bureaucracy to handle the affairs of insert migrant X group and all that. And basically it's a jobs program for a lot of the oligarchic class and also the bureaucratic class, but it hurts like the everyday American and those that actually want to preserve like their historic nation.
I love what you said, shopping mall with nukes. And I'm seeing, I'm really not liking what I'm seeing here in Mexico. I know I've talked to Morris Berman, the cultural historian who wrote the trilogy in the Fall of American Empire, who lives here in Mexico. He's talked about how Mexico is becoming Americanized. And it's really sad. Like everywhere you go now in Mexico, it's just monopolies everywhere. Power is concentrating. And of course, you still have like we call it abastos, the bazaar downtown where you can go and get all cheap, all the natural, fruits, food, meat, vegetables, fruits. But more and more you're seeing like nearby, the only places to shop are like Costco and Sam's and Walmart, and there's AutoZone and KFC and Home Depot, all here, McDonald's and Burger King, and it's just like, yeah. I was trying to run away from that, and it's here now. I don't know. I'm gonna have to run further, and like I don't know, I don't know what's going on. And another interesting point you've written about was left-wing Soros-linked organizations pushing amnesty for all illegal aliens. You mentioned that you kind of said that's kind of dead in the water for now. I think they've said they would grant citizenship to any illegal aliens who have come prior to 2010. That made me kind of look something up because conservative Ronald Reagan also granted amnesty and naturalization for illegal aliens. I'm not sure if the number is correct that 2.9 million or 3 million illegal aliens became US citizens. And so I'm not sure, but that may actually have been what allowed my parents to become U.S. citizens. I know they had arrived to the U.S. illegally, so I don't remember if they went. If they became citizens because of Reagan's amnesty program. So, I don't know what to think. How do we square this kind of circle of, Reagan and the conservatives did it back in the 80s, and now the left is trying to do it again today. How do we look at that,
Well, yeah, that was an interesting period of time because that's when the Republican Party was actually much more globalist. And when you had the really strong Bush influence there, and you had like Reagan basically talking about a kind of proto-NAFTA type of program, a really like globalist program with like Latin America at that time. And he essentially passed an amnesty that basically destroyed Republicans' chances in California because of just demographics. Like that's just the cold hard truth that many conservatives will refuse to acknowledge. And now you're kind of seeing it in the Southwest too, because of that amnesty. You're seeing the residual effects. Like Arizona recently flipped to the blue column. Texas is getting much more competitive for Democrats, largely due to these migrant demographics. The Republican Party at that time was very much dominated by the Chamber of Commerce, cheap labor crowd. And as a result, you kind of saw the backlash from Pat Buchanan. It was not a coincidence why after Reagan left office, Buchanan challenged George W. Bush in the primaries in 92. George H.W. Bush in the primaries in 92 on a pretty anti-globalist platform and calling for ending these interventions abroad, bringing back the troops home, and also restricting immigration. To some extent, you saw that with the rise of Ross Perot as well as blowback against the GOP's pro-corporate policies. But then you kind of saw a reversion back to the Con Inc. type of policies with George W. Bush. And the Bush family has massive dealings in Mexico. That's like very well documented. And I think that they basically do want to create just like one gigantic commercial zone between Mexico and the US and just erase the border and everything like that. But I think the GOP now is slightly different because of Trump. Regardless of what you think about Trump, I have plenty of criticism because of all his staff decisions and just the people he surrounded himself with. It has created new factions within the GOP that are much more immigration skeptic and also slightly more non-interventionist. They're more skeptic of these nation building schemes. But now the left, it's ironic. They used to be very critical of immigration on labor grounds. Like Bernie Sanders, people tend to forget this during the Bush era when he was proposing amnesty. He was one of the people that stood up against it because of the fact that it would dispossess American workers and all of that. But the roles have kind of reversed because the modern day Democrat Party is much more in the pocket of woke capital and other gigantic corporations. And many leftists now have made strange bedfellows with corporate entities and now are no longer really standing up for workers. That's why you'll see them basically be pushing for amnesty and also these weird trade deals like TPP or whatever that do not work to serve the interests of the American worker. So you are seeing kind of a realignment emerge now where the mainstream right, if you will, they're starting to take on more populist policies, and the left is becoming much more globalist, and it's purging out some of its more reasonable voices like Glenn Greenwald, Jimmy Dore, and other people that have traditionally been skeptical of the neoliberal status quo of the past 30 to 40 years.
And yeah, you mentioned the Bush family trying to create this giant North American economic zone, which is for me is their first approach to create, of globalism, is working economically, as we mentioned, the monopoly of malls here in Mexico. And I was shocked to hear AMLO. I knew this was coming, but it was strange to hear from AMLO last week said that he wanted to integrate Canada, USA, and Mexico, basically the North American Union. He literally said, AMLO, that based on the European Union model, to use the CELAC organization to kind of integrate US, Canada, and Mexico. So that was just kind of a bit shocking to hear it come from AMLO.
That indeed. He's a traditional leftist labor populist too. Like his background, that's actually pretty shocking. That's like if Bernie Sanders in the US said something to that effect.
Yeah, well, he was kind of emphasizing where the countries retain their sovereignty, okay, but still integrating. I mean, which way you cut it. I recall from the Canadian Fraser Institute, I forget the guy's name, who put out the white paper in the 90s on the Amero. He basically said, if this happened, that Washington would have 70% control of the monetary system, while Canada and Mexico would retain only 15%. So again, and even if you going by default going in that direction, Mexico will lose some of its sovereignty. I had a last question on Cuba. You had done for your Substack, for your paid subscribers recently, a talk on Cuba. I haven't been following closely what's going on in Cuba, but do you feel the status quo will continue to remain in Cuba, or do you see any major changes, democratization, so-called in Cuba coming?
It's an interesting question with regards to Cuba, because now that the Castros have become increasingly out of the picture, there's going to be definitely some legitimacy crises taking there and a transition towards a new leadership. So they're going to be tested. And I actually think the US is obviously going to make plays there. And there's already a discourse now where people are talking about potentially incorporating Cuba into the United States. You had Bill Kristol saying in a tweet several months ago that once Cuba is liberated, we should consider adding it to the US as a 51st, 52nd state, if you will. That's obviously a long-term project, but the fact that it's actually being floated out there is interesting, because I think it's pretty obvious when you have a country that's as strong as the US and a country that's so close to the US like Cuba, that's on a wayward path. The people in DC definitely want to effect some form of regime change and turn it into just another appendage of its massive consumer imperium. So, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. I think that they may switch to a more managed democracy model a la Venezuela or Turkey, or to some extent Russia, to transition to that, because the Castro dynasty model definitely was a thing that may have had validity for the Cuban state in the 20th century, but I think that now it's probably has to evolve a bit. But there will definitely be a lot of subversion from abroad. And I also think you might see a lot of geopolitical jousting too, with the rise of China and also Russia, which have pretty solid interests in Cuba, as well as countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua. So there's definitely gonna be some battles there, because I think that if the US really still sees itself as this like unipolar power that could take on Russia and China in their own backyards, I think those great powers will respond in kind and take on the US in its own backyard by trying to prop up regimes in Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, or even to potentially, I think, try to weaponize migration in Mexico and Central America. Because if you're going to put military assets on our borders, then we'll do other subversive stuff. We'll respond in kind by messing things up in your neck of the woods. So it's a chess match, and I think that we're going to see that play out in countries like Cuba, and we already kind of saw that play out to some extent in Venezuela, where you saw China, Russia, and a constellation of other powers from Iran, Turkey, say that we're going to prop up the Maduro regime, and we're not going to buy into the idea that Guaido or any other person is like the legitimate leader of Venezuela, because they've already done the color revolution stuff all over Russia's backyard, and to some extent they're going to probably start doing that more in China with the announcement of AUKUS and the pivot to Asia. So I think you're going to see some really hardcore geopolitical jousting taking place in the Western Hemisphere if the US gets too uppity in other parts of the globe.
I hadn't heard that idea of Cuba being incorporated into the U.S., but it doesn't surprise me at all. And you mentioned chessboard. In fact, I think that the rules of the international relations, grand chessboard of the game have completely changed, and now we're in this kind of supranational globalist world regime where nation states no longer can compete economically, politically, geopolitically. And from here on out, it's just going to be regional blocks, regional unions like the European Union. That's the name of the game. And as I said, we saw AMLO now declare a initiative to go towards a North American union. We see UK now talking about joining into that, which is actually a 1939 globalist plan that was discussed, creating this Atlantic Union that starts with the Britain and US together, like an economic integration, right, regional union. And then this is how they create the ultimate world union. So I wouldn't be surprised at all Cuba joining, and you have this North American zone, and then the South American union and zone, and that's just how I see things going forward. I think you left us with a good final thought there on geopolitical jousting. If you have any other final thought, and then otherwise, you're on Twitter at Jose Al Niño, and your website is also josealnino.com. But you're also like on a million other platforms. You have Substack, you have a podcast. People can support you on Patreon, Subscribestar, and you're also featured in a bunch of places: Mises, Big League Politics. I think sometimes on Zero Hedge and elsewhere. Where do people go to best follow your work?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Jose Al Niño is where you can find my free stuff on Twitter. I'm generally posting there every day, especially my articles from Big League Politics, Liberty Conservative News, and the Mises Institute. Now, for my more like in-depth content, you'll find it at Substack, Jose Niño Unfiltered. And then I have my podcast that's more for like the premium subscribers, El Niño Speaks, where I talk about all sorts of issues. And if you subscribe to my Substack and go for the paid options, you'll receive that. And last but certainly not least, this dovetails into what I talked about, localism. I have my own type of political newsletter on Patreon and Subscribestar called The Niño File. That's where I train people and give them advice on how to run political campaigns and set up groups at the local level so that they can get more involved and fight back against the many establishment actors that are undermining our freedom. That's called The Niño File, and you could subscribe there on Subscribestar or Patreon.
All right. If you enjoy Jose Niño's perspective, sign up to his newsletter and follow him on Twitter and everywhere else he mentioned. I'll include the links in the description. It's always good to chat, Jose.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast interview. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list through which you can receive an update of every new podcast, as well as a long list of key news headlines once a week. We're being heavily censored. YouTube has deleted some of our videos, and we currently have one strike. Patreon has terminated our account. Facebook has restricted our page, and Reddit has been deleting posts. Our favorite social media channels are Telegram and Twitter. The best places to watch the podcast beyond YouTube are on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon. The best places to listen to the podcast are on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, Google, or on any other podcast app. To help keep this podcast alive, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and wherever else. Subscribe to all our platforms and leave a donation if possible via Subscribestar, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum. You can also find us on MeWe, Minds, Gab, Float, VK, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.